Dave! Doc Hallen's been killed.
Doc Hallen? What happened?
It's over at his place. You gotta come now.
Now, wait a minute, Steve. Tell us what happened.
Well, I'm trying to tell you. Now, this thing had killed the doc.
Well, what was it?
Stop with it, kid. But it's kind of like a mass. It keeps getting bigger and bigger.
Come on, Steve. Makes sense.
I know. Look, Dave, you gotta see this thing to believe what I'm telling you. Maybe the thing you saw was a monster? Yeah, maybe it was.
Welcome to episode 51 of the Horror Double Bill, the podcast where each week we pair two movies to create something greater than the sum of their parts. I'm Craig Johnson, and this week we are exploring the amorphous world of the sci-fi horror hybrid, with two movies that pit man against gelatinous monstrosities from inner and outer space. First up, we have X the Unknown from 1956. An early entry into the horror market from British studio Hammer, and a film which, quote, firmly established Hammer's transition from B-movie thrillers to out-and-out horror science fiction, end quote. This was directed by Leslie Norman and stars Dean Jagger, McKern and Edward Chapman. Then we jump forward to 1988 for one of the more enjoyable horror remakes of the 1980s, even though it was barely recognised as such at the time. This is the enjoyably goofy The Blob from director Chuck Russell and co-writer Frank Darabont, and stars Kevin Dillon, Shawnee Smith, Donovan Leitch, DeMunn and Candy Clark. Along the way, we'll be discussing the careers of writers-directors Jimmy Sangster and Chuck Russell, unlikely parallels with Steven Spielberg's Jaws, shapeless monstrosities in the horror movie, the inspiration for and the production story of the 1958 version of The Blob, and much, much more. But before we do any of that though, I'd just like to mention the main sources that I've used in researching this week's episode, and as always, all sources will be listed or linked in the show notes. So when discussing X the Unknown, I have heavily referenced the books The House That Hammer Built, Volume 2, 1950 to 1954, and Volume 3, 1955 to 1958, both of which were written by Wayne Kinsey. I've also referenced the books Hammer and Beyond, the British horror film by Peter Hutchings, Hammer Films, an exhaustive filmography by Tom Johnson and Deborah Del Vecchio, and interviews and articles on the websites strasbourgfestival.com and thehammergraveyard.org.uk. And when discussing The Blob, I have referred to the book The Father of the Blob, The Making of a Monster Smash and Other Hollywood Tales by Jack H. Harris, interviews, commentaries and extras on the Blu-ray release of the film from Scream Factory, and a feature and interviews from the January 1989 issue of Fear magazine. And as usual, I have also referred to the IMDb and Wikipedia pages for the movies, directors, cast and crew. As we've discussed in other episodes, the 1950s was not a great time for the film industry in both the UK and other territories. Television had become increasingly popular, something which put pressure on the box office and also film production studios. As a response, these studios sought new methods by which to entice viewers away from their homes and back into movie theatres, and this included widescreen formats like CinemaScope and Cinerama, stereophonic sound, gimmicks like 3D, and also immersive colour. All of this, of course, was fine, if rather expensive, for major American film producers, but much of it was out of the reach of the smaller independents, which included Hammer Studios here in the UK. But there was one attention-grabbing method that, while risky, was available to all: the introduction of edgy and adult-orientated content that would not be permissible on TV. Up to the 1930s, in the UK there had been 2 certificates applied to cinema, both of which were advisory rather than compulsory. There was Universal, or U, indicating films that were suitable for all ages, and Adult, indicating that the film was more suitable for a mature audience. This, though, all changed in 1931, following the success of the Universal horror cycle, and specifically the success of James Whale's Frankenstein. This film was so upsetting to audiences of the time that it prompted the National Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children to complain to the British Home Office, saying that the censors were being insufficiently vigilant in their approach to horrific material. This led to the introduction of the H certificate, with H standing for horrific. But although this was seen by some local authorities as an opportunity to restrict under 18s from viewing certain films, the H certificate was still very much advisory, and this remained the case until 1951. By the 1950s, though, cinema had begun to explore far more adult themes, firstly as a means of competing with the television market, and also, as the major studios began to lose their monopolies on cinema, as a method of competing with independent and foreign films, which often explored far darker and more daring themes. At the same time, the rigidity of the Hays Code, enforced in Hollywood since 1934, began to lose its grip, leading to a 1952 landmark decision by the US Supreme Court. This recognized that film, as a significant medium for the communication of ideas, fell within First Amendment rights and was therefore entitled to free speech protections. This essentially struck down the legal basis through which government or state censors could ban or alter movies. And while it didn't eliminate the Hays Code altogether, it did effectively remove the studio's incentives to comply with it. Reacting to these changes, in the UK in 1950, a government committee set up to review film censorship recommended a new certification system and introduced new film ratings. The H certificate was replaced by a new and compulsory X certificate, which covered a far wider group of films than simply horror, and also restricted entry to the cinema only to those over the age of 16. While the introduction of this certificate may have seemed rather restricting, it also presented something of an opportunity, and one which Hammer Studios in the UK decided to grab with both hands. Hitherto, they were the producer of B-movies and crime dramas, but they were keen to move into new territory, and ironically, it was in the competing world of television that they found it. This was with the series The Quatermass Experiment, which had been screened by the BBC in 1953, initially to fill a gap in production schedules following the coronation of Queen Elizabeth II. Hammer had already some experience of dramatising BBC series for the cinema, and seeing the cultural phenomena of Quatermass, were keen to produce a film version, leaning in not only to the success of the original source material, but also to the introduction of X certification. As screenwriter Nigel Neal would put it later, quote, "It was something new, and Hammer could smell it. Quatermass had been quite successful on television, and they were aware of it. The BBC, I think, had tarted it around for any sales they could get. But companies were scared of the X certificate. It was fairly new, and they thought if a film had an X, it would never make money. No one would go to see it because they'd be so nervous." At Hammer, however, James Carreras made a big deal out of the X certificate. He, very cheaply, replaced the EX of experiment with X. It obviously worked, and they must have made a packet. End quote. And work for them it certainly did. The Quatermass Experiment was released in August 1955 as part of a double bill with another X certificate film, a French crime drama called Rififi. The pairing was a huge success, and trade publication Kino Weekly was quick to pass comment, though it has to be said this was not entirely favourable, writing in December 1955, quote, "Has the X certificate become a box office asset? On current evidence, the answer must be an emphatic yes. Blackboard Jungle took a packet. I Am a Camera has just concluded a highly profitable London run, and the X Certificate double bill, the Quatermass Experiment and Rififi got off to a flying start last Monday. The British Board of Film Censors certainly started something when it created the X Certificate, and nobody knows where it will finish." End quote. Understandably, Hammer were very keen to repeat this success, and as soon as it became clear that the Quatermass Experiment would be successful, they began thinking of how they were going to follow it. Although Nigel Kneale had already written Quatermass 2 for the BBC, it would not begin airing until October of that year, and Hammer were keen to move ahead more quickly. One afternoon, producer Anthony Hines, executive and producer Michael Carreras, and a production manager named Jimmy Sangster debated what they could do next. In his excellent history of the studio, The House That Hammer Built, writer Wayne Kinsey quotes Sangster's recollection of this meeting. Quote, "Tony, Michael, and myself were sitting around the office one day, and I said, instead of a monster coming from outer space, how about a monster that comes from the centre of the earth? And then Tony said, oh yeah, maybe so-and-so. And Michael said so-and-so, and I said so-and-so. And at the end of an hour, we got sort of a rough story together, and Tony said, you came up with the most ideas, go away and write it. I said, look, I'm not a writer for Christ's sake, I'm a production manager. And he said, well, write it and we'll pay you as a production manager, but if we like it, we'll pay you as a writer as well. So I went and wrote the treatment, they liked the treatment, and then the same thing happened. Tony said, all right, go and write the script, and if we like it, we'll pay you. So I went and wrote the script, and they paid me £450, and that's how I became a writer." End quote. Aged just 27 at the time of that conversation, to call Jimmy Sangster only a writer would be an understatement, to say the least. A creative driving force behind the emerging Hammer horror brand, from these humble beginnings, he would go on to craft the screenplays for 1957's The Curse of Frankenstein, Dracula and The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, and The Mummy and The Brides of Dracula in 1959 and 1960 respectively, and these are really only the tip of the iceberg. He was born in 1927 in a town called Kinmel Bay in North Wales. He was supposedly the first baby boy born there, and as a result, his estate agent father was persuaded to include the town's name when naming his son, hence his full birth name of James Henry Kinmel Sangster. A huge film fan from an early age, he once said that he always knew his career would be in the movies. After leaving school at 15, he got a job as a projectionist, something that he said was relatively easy to find because everybody else was off fighting in the war. But he clearly wasn't that great at it, as he soon got fired, and then found himself in a job with a film production company as a camera assistant, a job from which he was fired as well. But, as luck would have it, he then began working as an assistant to a writer-director called John Carstairs on a morale-boosting documentary about the Navy. Carstairs knew that Sangster had been fired from his previous jobs and offered to get him a job at Ealing Studios, where he began working, at the age of 17, as a third assistant. He worked on 2 films for Ealing, and then, when he turned 18, was called up for national service. During this time, he was positioned with the RAF and was stationed in India for 2 years, an experience that he said, quote, made me very cross. I knew that everybody was coming out of the army and taking all the jobs, and that I would have a terrible time getting one myself. But as it turned out, he needn't have worried. When he was demobbed in 1949, he joined a studio that, at the time, was called Exclusive Films, and which would later go on to become Hammer. Beginning as a third assistant director, his first film for them was Dick Barton Strikes Back, which, much like the later Quatermass pictures, was based on a BBC serial of the time, only this case it was on the radio. He then moved on to work on films including The Man in Black and Room to Let, both of which we've mentioned before, and also numerous other B-movies and thrillers, gradually working his way up through the ranks until, at the age of 27, he found himself in a meeting room with Anthony Hines and Michael Carreras, discussing the story for what would become our first film of the week. All of which does indeed bring us on to our first film of the week, which, in keeping with Hammer's dalliance with the new film certification, is titled X, the Unknown. This was, as we've heard, scripted by Jimmy Sangster, and it was directed by Leslie Norman. It stars Dean Jagger, Liam McKern, and Edward Chapman. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so, as usual, if you have yet to see the film, please approach the rest of this episode with all due caution. X the Unknown was initially considered as a direct sequel to the Quatermass experiment, and the intention was that the scientist protagonist would be Professor Quatermass. But this idea was very soon stopped in its tracks by the writer Nigel Kneale. Rather famously, Kneale had been less than happy with the Hammer version of his story, particularly the depiction of his Professor Quatermass as portrayed by Brian Donlevy. This was also no doubt exacerbated by the fact that, although the BBC received a nice remuneration from the sale of the TV series, as a staff writer at the network, Kneale had received absolutely nothing. When the time came to renew his contract at the BBC, he very wisely renegotiated the terms of his employment, but needless to say, this initial deal proved a bone of contention for years to come. And while the BBC may have owned the rights to the original story of the Quatermass experiment, it was Kneale who owned the rights to the character, and when approached by Hammer to use Quatermass in their proposed follow-up, the answer was a resounding no. This backstory has led many to call X the Unknown a Quatermass story in all but name, and the narrative certainly follows the basic Quatermass model. The central government scientist, here called Dr. Royston, is, like his predecessor, something of a maverick pushing back against the establishment. And, like the Quatermass films, this movie deals with the real-world and Cold War terrors of the 1950s. Specifically, in this case, it is the threat of nuclear destruction, coming, as it does, a decade after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The very opening of the film depicts a military exercise involving small amounts of radiation, though it has to be said, to a modern eye, the troops appear rather free and easy with the sample of uranium, and this is something that actually happens throughout the film. Nevertheless, we are soon told that, quote, if it ever comes to the real thing, the radioactivity won't be harmless, it will be extremely lethal, end quote. This theme is then later built on when a grieving father attacks Dr. Royston verbally in the hospital, saying, quote, I know about you, Dr. Royston. You're a scientist, not a doctor. You don't look after the sick. You meddle with things that kill, like they killed my boy in there. You should be locked up, Royston, locked up with others like you, letting off bombs you can't control. You're not safe. You're a murderer, end quote. But while this dialogue hints at a debate about the conflicting role of science as either benefactor or destroyer, the film doesn't really develop the idea much further, and this stands in direct contrast to the first two Quatermass films, which at the very least suggest that science can become dangerous when it is driven by hubris or ambition, or allowed to operate without the proper checks and balances. In fact, X the Unknown actually goes some way in the opposite direction, with Royston responding to the father's accusations by saying, quote, it isn't true, you know. It isn't true at all. We only try to create, not destroy, end quote. The film is also tonally very different from the Quatermass movies, structured around key set pieces that reach more towards horror than science fiction, anticipating Hammer's move into out-and-out gothic with The Curse of Frankenstein a year later. These set pieces include a little boy being chased by something in the woods, two soldiers coming to a grisly end on the wasteland at night, Peter the scientist being lowered into a chasm only to have something monstrous rushing up to greet him, and a young child left carelessly outside a church as the monstrous entity approaches. It is also far more violent, featuring scenes of radiation burns, swelling body parts and melting faces that caused more than a few issues with the censors, both in post-production and even before filming began. When the draft script was initially submitted to the BBFC in November 1955, the reception was less than enthusiastic, with the censors saying in an internal memo, quote, "This is a mixture of scientific hokum and sadism in equal parts, without benefit of wit or humour, and incidentally a wretched exploitation of the X certificate. I'm upset that we cannot reject it. Our only course is to insist on drastic pruning when they make a shooting script." End quote. At the start of December, the secretary of the BBFC wrote to Anthony Hines requesting numerous changes, and they also insisted on seeing the final shooting script. They also advised, quote, "You might perhaps find it helpful, in this particular case, to show us a few rushes before shooting is too far advanced." End quote. And while Hammer certainly took some notice of this advice, they were also not overly concerned. After all, they were looking to get another X certificate. Filming began on the 9th of January 1956, but almost immediately the shoot ran into problems. Much as with American actor Brian Donlevy in the Quatermass movies, here Hammer employed the strategy of hiring an American actor to play the lead, something that would help the film sell far more effectively in the States. In this case, they hired the actor Dean Jagger, who had begun his film career in 1929 with the movie The Woman from Hell. An incredibly talented performer, he would eventually go on to win an Oscar for Best Supporting Actor for his role in the movie 12 O'Clock High, released in 1949. But he was also a fervent anti-communist, and this caused an issue with the director originally chosen to helm X the Unknown. This was the American Joseph Losey, who had been blacklisted by Hollywood during the McCarthy witch hunts. By all accounts, Jagger refused to work with him, and given that Jagger was the studio's main star, with his salary making up half of the film's total budget, Losey was released from his contract, although the official story was that he had withdrawn due to illness. So, although he had already begun pre-production, he was duly replaced, shortly before filming was due to begin, by a new director called Leslie Norman. The name Leslie Norman may not be a familiar one, but British listeners of a certain age will have heard of his son, the film critic Barry Norman, who hosted a weekly review programme on the BBC for 26 years, between 1972 and 1998. To say that his father was less than enthusiastic about coming onto the project would be something of an understatement. Jimmy Sangster recalled that he really didn't want to do it, saying that, quote, "He came onto a picture that had already been cast and the sets built, which is never a good thing. You become nothing more than a cop directing traffic, and Leslie knew he was better than that. And boy, did he let us know it." End quote. Described by the cast and crew as a natural antagonist, it is said that while he was a very good technical director, across the course of filming he managed to argue with the whole of the crew at some point or another, and was also frequently and loudly abusive. As camera operator Len Harris later said, quote, "He was one of the few people that wasn't liked at Hammer," end quote. And it's worth noting that, despite the quality of the finished product, he wasn't asked to direct for the studio again until 1968, when he provided some uncredited directing assistance on the studio's movie The Lost Continent. So it's safe to say then that the atmosphere he created on set wasn't conducive to a positive working environment, and this is something that was compounded by the need to film the external locations in the middle of winter, with the ground alternating between being frozen solid and then thawing to turn into literal marshland. X the Unknown opens on a military training site in Scotland, which in reality was a gravel pit just outside of London. Here we see a routine army training exercise underway, with the troops tasked with finding radioactive materials using a Geiger counter. This exercise, filmed with the cooperation of the British War Office, is interrupted by a sudden explosion, injuring 2 of the soldiers and leaving them badly disfigured by what appear to be radiation burns. This sequence acts as the catalyst for the rest of the story, and it also showcases Sangster's ability to pen 3-dimensional characters. The relationship between the ill-fated soldier Lansing and the rest of his platoon is drawn economically but vividly, something which is aided by strong supporting performances from the likes of Anthony Newley and Hammer fan favourite Michael Ripper as the sergeant. From here we are introduced to our protagonist and Quatermass stand-in, Dr. Adam Royston, who works at the Atomic Energy Commission. We are also quite quickly introduced to the central human antagonist, the head of the facility Elliot, who is played by Edward Chapman. Chapman had made a name for himself playing officious superiors, most notably opposite British comedian Norman Wisdom, and his character here is no exception. Within the first few seconds of meeting him, we hear him laying down the law to Royston, saying, quote, "I am in charge here, and I shall decide what you do and don't do." End quote. For the rest of the movie, Elliot will take on the role of the obstructive authority figure, joining a long line of cinematic characters whose hubris or overwhelming self-interest leads them to dismiss all warnings from the hero, until of course the appearance of the monster ultimately proves them wrong. Much like Mayor Larry Vaughn in Jaws, his job is to preserve order and insist that the experts are overreacting. But there is also a personal issue between him and Royston fueling the flames. This is in the shape of Elliot's son Peter, who has ambitions to be a scientist, which Royston is encouraging. However, his father believes that Peter has a far greater future ahead of him working in administration and management. Unfortunately, though, after introducing this idea, the film doesn't really take it much further, and I have to say, it does feel a bit like a dropped opportunity. Royston, as an expert in atomic energy, is called in by the army to give his expert opinion on the explosion. But when he arrives, he can find no sign of radioactivity, despite the radiation burns that have started to appear on those nearest to the blast. These, along with other special makeup effects, were provided by Phil Leakey, who would go on to create the makeup effects for Christopher Lee in The Curse of Frankenstein. And his work on X the Unknown is both impressive and also something of a landmark, as it earned him the first ever on-screen credit explicitly for special makeup effects. As well as the radiation blisters, he also created the melting hands and faces of the monster's victims, results he achieved through no small amount of experimentation and teamwork with other members of the crew. He even took his work home with him, as at Hammer's Bray Studios there was, at the time, no real special effects makeup laboratory. Sadly, his hard work, while doubtless a contributing factor to Hammer's early success in the horror market, went unrewarded, and despite creating the makeup for this, The Curse of Frankenstein, and Dracula, he eventually left the studio when his retainer was revoked as a cost-cutting measure by executive Anthony Nelson Keyes. By this time, the film, with its atomic scientists and Geiger counters, is sitting firmly within the land of science fiction, but it is in the next sequence that it truly shifts into horror, with the first of the film's main set pieces, heralded with a cautionary warning from Dr. Royston. Travelling back from the site with young Peter Elliot, he warns him to not conjure up visions of nameless monsters creeping around in the night, which leads to a brief comic reaction from their driver, while also foreshadowing the scene that immediately follows. That night, 2 young boys, Willie and Ian, are playing dares in the nearby woods, a nicely menacing scene accompanied by an evocative score from regular Hammer composer James Bernard. Willie encounters something off-screen that causes him to flee in terror, an unseen monstrosity that crackles and fizzes, represented by a subjective camera that follows as he flees into the night, Ian chasing after him, asking what he has seen. Young Ian, incidentally, is played by a very young actor called Fraser Hines, who would go on to gain television fame as Jamie, assistant to Patrick Troughton's Doctor Who, before settling into a regular career on British evening soap opera Emmerdale Farm. The next day, Willie is admitted to hospital with radiation burns, and Royston is called in for expert opinion once again. After examining the boy in hospital and tracking down Ian, he begins to investigate further. He first discovers an empty and now harmless uranium container in a tower that's being used as a moonshine still, and he then discovers that his own laboratory has been broken into, with further uranium taken. He also discovers a strange glistening substance that something has left behind. At this point, we are introduced to a new character, Mac McGill, the head of security at the Atomic Energy Commission, who has been called in by the government to help with the investigation. We also encounter more obstruction from director Elliot, who becomes more and more like Mayor Larry Vaughan in Jaws as the movie progresses, with Royston and Mac taking on the roles of Brody and Hooper. Another Jaws parallel comes quickly after, when young Willie dies in the hospital. Shortly after this, his father rages against Royston's supposed culpability in his son's death, in much the same way as Mrs. Kittner rages against Sergeant Brody on the dock. Though, to be fair, she probably had more of a point. I'm not suggesting, by the way, that Spielberg used X the Unknown as the model for his shark-themed blockbuster over 20 years later, but more that what this film is doing is laying out the tropes that would become central to genre cinema ever after. As well as the two protagonists fighting against an obstructive establishment and the tearful rage of a bereaved parent, we also have a scene where Peter is slowly lowered into the fissure, only to be met with something monstrous rising to get him, and also a moment where a little girl is left abandoned, in a moment of panic, on the steps of the church. And we can see variants of these sequences in any number of subsequent movies, including, of course, Steven Spielberg's Jaws. But at the very least, though, we do know of one director who was directly inspired by this movie and who has gone on record as saying so. As we discussed back in episode 14, John Carpenter, who is a big fan of the film, consciously echoed the climax of the movie in his film The Fog, replacing Peter's frantic attempts to pull his truck out of the mud with Jamie Lee Curtis and Tom Atkins doing the same as they try to evade the spirits of the dead. There's also the scene of the police car being cut off by the monster in the town of Lockmouth, necessitating a sudden reverse and change of direction, once again pretty much replicated in Carpenter's film, suggesting that X the Unknown had a lasting impact on him, both consciously and unconsciously. From here, we now come to the film's big moment of horror, where radiologist Harry, seeking a little R&R with nurse Zena, is literally melted in front of her, his hands swelling and appearing to burst before the skin begins to liquefy on his skull. It's a truly surprising moment if you aren't expecting it, accompanied by the horrified screaming of Nurse Zena, who is left so traumatized that we are told later she won't be able to tell you her own name. This is pretty much immediately followed by another of the film's set pieces, with the deaths of soldiers Spider and Haggis as they stand guard on the site of the original explosion. This was something that was initially suggested by Royston, who, as it turns out, signed their death warrants in doing so. That he later shows absolutely no remorse or guilt at his part in their demise is, for me, another lost opportunity, and it would have given his character a little more substance and humanity, which, on analysis, is rather lacking. But disregarding Royston's subsequent lack of emotion or remorse, this scene is still highly effective, beginning with some light comedy work before the two characters meet their crackling and glowing deaths. But another weakness in the screenplay is revealed shortly after, and this is the synaptic leap required of Royston to piece the mystery together, which challenges credulity, to say the least. Relying on the fact that he conveniently once wrote a thesis on a similar subject, he suggests, pretty much out of nowhere, that forces within the earth have developed an intelligence in much the same way that man developed above ground. This explanation requires not so much a suspension of disbelief as it does to take disbelief bungee jumping, and much as I'm not a fan of Institute director Elliot, you can hardly blame him for his somewhat incredulous response. Quote, "We've been told a story based on a little fact and a great deal of fiction. I'm amazed that this story has been accepted by all of you without the slightest doubt or hesitation. I said just now I thought the whole thing was fantastic. I'll go further than that. It's absolute rubbish. Dr. Royston, you're a scientist. You deal with facts. A man of your intelligence and capability has no right to talk as you just have. You astound me." End quote. Admittedly, his follow-up argument that there must be some perfectly logical explanation for everything does let his point down a little, but you can hardly blame him for being surprised at Royston's initial hypothesis. But even though Royston is of course correct, even then he is ignored by the military, who decide against his advice that the best thing to do is to blow the whole thing up and then seal it with concrete. The army here is clearly just as obtuse as director Elliot, with the commander announcing rather smugly, quote, "The trouble with some of these scientific types is that they can't see the easy way out of anything. It's got to be complicated if it's going to work." End quote. Needless to say, this demonstration of firepower over intellect backfires quite spectacularly. Until this point, the film has very wisely kept the monster hidden, though, as we know, this strategy only works for so long. At some point, audiences need to see what is lurking in the darkness. And sadly, much like Bruce the shark in Jaws, the monster becomes something of a disappointment, though it has to be said that the premise of the movie, atomic and sentient mud, was hardly going to inspire the most terrifying of creations. The monster was created by a special effects company called Bowie Margutti & Co., who had created the monster for the climax of the Quatermass experiment out of literal tripe, and who were here charged with a new set of problems. Quote, "It was a monster that moves by rolling like liquid, so that presented a whole lot of new problems. A lot of it was done with these tiny little worms you use for fishing, mixed in with something like polycell paste to give it body. You get the movement, because all of these little worms were always moving, and you got this lovely feeling that the whole thing was moving. We decided to shoot it in a glass tank filled with paraffin, and it smelled terrible. The miniature set was built and then lowered into this tank. It was then filled with paraffin, and we filmed through the glass front. The monster was about 12 inches across, and all the sets were built on a slope so that it would always roll down." End quote. Despite their best efforts, once the monster appears, much of the menace is gone, and it's up to Phil Leakey and one more grisly death, that of the power plant security guard, to rack up the tension again. There are also the previously mentioned scenes involving a small child left alone outside the church, and the climactic moments featuring Peter in the truck, where it actually appears that he will end up as some form of sacrificial victim. And given that, up to this point, the film has already killed an innocent child and melted the face of a character right in front of us, this does momentarily at least seem somewhat likely. But of course, he survives in the end. Sadly, my disappointment in the reveal of the monster isn't just the jaded retrospective view from the 21st century, as critics of the time shared a similar perspective. The Monthly Film Bulletin of 1956 was equally disappointed, saying, quote, "X the Unknown intriguingly suggests a new addition to the science fiction repertoire of things. But after a series of prolonged climaxes, with its potential victim staring directly into the camera and shaking with fright, the unknown finally emerges as a type of rolling rubber mattress, disappointingly unhorrific in content and appearance. Scientific explanations for the object's arrival are disconcertingly vague. One is left with the impression that the unknown has been created with the sole purpose of maneuvering its elaborate destruction, and the script sometimes suggests this in a number of unintentionally comic lines. It seems likely, therefore, that enthusiasts may find the present adventure rather tame when compared with the more grisly experiments of Professor Quatermass." End quote. Others, however, were a little more generous, with industry journal Kine Weekly calling the film a first-rate British shocker, while Variety wrote that it was, quote, "a highly imaginative and fanciful meller with tense dramatic overtones that will help it along at the box office." End quote. It was released in the UK in September 1956 as part of a double bill with the French psychological thriller Les Diaboliques, which was released with the English language title of The Fiends. A very strange pairing, it has to be said, but one that was rather successful, with Kine Weekly commenting that the pairing helped to, quote, "confirm that X certificate successes are no flash in the pan." Hammer, though, had something of a change of heart, realising that the X certificate, which they had actively played up to, ultimately meant limited bookings, impacting potential profit. As a result, in a total 180, they petitioned for the film to be reclassified as an A certificate, making it more widely available and, of course, therefore, much more profitable. In March 1957, 6 months after the film had opened, they wrote to the censors for reclassification, saying, quote, "Many months ago, we made the above picture and tried very hard to get an X certificate for it. Through the kindness of censor Arthur Watkins, who stretched everything for us, we achieved that X certificate. Our branch managers, though, are now telling us that the picture is not an X picture and really should have an A certificate. We would therefore like to resubmit the picture to you, and we are confident that with only a couple of small cuts, you will be able to give us an A certificate, which will enable us to play the picture in so many situations we cannot get into now." End quote. The response, perhaps not surprisingly, given the dying children, melting faces, and radiation burns, was a polite but definite no. Quote, "We have carefully considered what you say. But I'm afraid no useful purpose would be served by us seeing the film again with a view to granting an A certificate, since both story and treatment are, in our view, inescapably X." End quote. The phrase, "hoist by your own petard," springs to mind. 2 months later, in May 1957, the film was released in the States as the support for what is often called the first of the true Hammer horrors, The Curse of Frankenstein, starring Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee. Of the two, Curse was, of course, the showstopper, and X the Unknown paled by comparison. But Trade Paper The Exhibitor did say that, quote, "it has enough suspense to attract and hold interest, despite a yarn that takes its time in telling." End quote. Variety, meanwhile, reviewed it a second time for its American release, and this time was far more critical, calling it, quote, "a poor and complicated science fictioner not for discriminating audiences. The picture carries a complicated structure that is difficult to follow. The unknown that serves as the menace in this science fiction yarn is so vague that its origins may be over-mystified. Roles are strictly static, and Leslie Norman's direction isn't able to rise above what was handed to him." End quote. To be fair to the movie, though, I'm not entirely sure what they found complicated about the plot or what is quite so difficult to follow in the narrative. Aside from the convoluted explanation of the creature's origins, everything else seems fairly straightforward, and even then that's not so much hard to follow as it is hard to swallow. Today, X the Unknown is, ironically enough, probably not the best known of Hammer's movies, falling as it does between the Quatermass Experiment and Quatermass 2, and failing to really live up to either. But while it is certainly flawed, it is still highly enjoyable, particularly in its willingness to brutally dispatch so many characters, young and old alike. If nothing else, it is perhaps one of the earliest, if not the first, of the creeping and oozing shapeless monster movies that would follow, including, of course, 1958's The Blob. Following his screenwriting debut, Jimmy Sangster would write the screenplays for both The Curse of Frankenstein and Dracula, though he was incredibly self-deprecating about this later, saying, quote, "I wrote horror movies because it was my job. If Tony Hines had asked me to write a carry-on movie as my first effort, I would have turned out to be a comedy writer. So when anybody asks me what were the influences that prompted me to be a horror film writer, I tell them it was the wages." End quote. Financial motivation or not, there is no doubt that his screenplays contributed significantly to the success of Hammer Studios. He went on to write the screenplays for many of what are now considered the studio's best films, including The Revenge of Frankenstein in 1958, The Mummy in 1959, The Brides of Dracula in 1960, A Taste of Fear in 1961, and Dracula, Prince of Darkness in 1966. In 1970, he was offered the opportunity to direct, though it must be said his efforts here are more of a mixed bag, possibly due to the timing, as we've discussed before, by this time Hammer was on the decline. In 1970, he directed The Horror of Frankenstein, followed by 1971's Lust for a Vampire, neither of which are very good, and that is if we are being very, very kind. Much better is the psychological thriller Fear in the Night, released in 1972, and which stars Ralph Bates, Judy Geeson, Peter Cushing, and a scenery-chewing turn from Joan Collins, which is good fun, if lacking anything in the way of real surprises. In 1967, his first novel, Private Eye, was published, and was then adapted as a US TV movie called Spy Killer, released in 1969. This led to a great deal of work on American TV as either a story editor or scriptwriter, including episodes of Kolchak the Night Stalker, Wonder Woman, The $6 Million Man, and Ironside. In later years, as Hammer underwent a revival, he was asked to record DVD commentaries and expressed considerable surprise that anyone would be particularly interested in his work. Self-effacing to the last, he died at the age of 83 in 2011. All of which brings us on to our second film of the week, which is The Blob from 1988. This stars Kevin Dillon, Shawnee Smith, Donovan Leitch, Jeffrey DeMunn, and Candy Clark, and was directed by Chuck Russell. The Blob is a remake of a B-movie that was released in the States in 1958, 1 year after X the Unknown appeared stateside, and 2 years after it premiered in the UK. But while it might be tempting to suggest that it was inspired by Hammer's globulous monster, this is not the case, as, if rumours are to be believed, the Blob originated from a quote-unquote true story. On September the 27th, 1950, the Philadelphia Inquirer ran a news report under the headline, "Flying Saucer Just Dissolves." The text beneath this went on to say, quote, "4 South Philadelphia police officers had a new explanation last night to what happens to those flying saucers people are always seeing. They dissolve. That's what happened last night to the airborne object first seen about 10 p.m. by patrolmen John Collins and Joseph Keenan. The 2 officers said they were patrolling in their car on Veer Boulevard near 26th Street, when through the windshield they saw what appeared to be a parachute drifting slowly down from the upper air ahead of them. When first seen, the thing was at treetop level, they said, and appeared to be about 6 feet in diameter. It settled in an open field near 29th Street. After summoning Street Sergeant Joseph Cook and Patrolman James Casper, his driver, they went into the field to investigate. The 4 officers stood a few feet from the object, they said, and turned their flashlight on it, whereupon it gave off a purple glow, almost a mist that looked as though it contained crystals. Cook stepped forward and tried to pick the thing up. The part of the mass on which he laid his hands dissolved, leaving nothing but slight odourless sticky residue. Within 25 minutes, as they stood and watched, the entire substance had evaporated. It was so light, they said, that it did not even bend the weeds on which it lighted. Sergeant Cook notified the FBI, a little sheepishly since, as he pointed out, he had nothing whatever to show them when they arrived, except a magic circle on the ground where something purple and quite evanescent had once been. End quote. This story was then picked up in the national press, though much of the reporting was more humorous than anything. It's been suggested that what they saw is what is called star jelly, which is a translucent and slimy substance occasionally found on grass or trees. The first documented sightings date back to the 14th century, and according to folklore, it is the result of meteor showers. But science believes it to be either a form of fungus or even the decomposing remains of frogs or toads. While this story may have been the initial inspiration for the Blob, according to producer Jack H. Harris, the idea came through a brainstorming session between him and a man called Irving H. Millgate. During this session, Millgate came up with the idea of, quote, a monster that has never been seen before, a mineral form of life from another world. It defies gravity by climbing trees and has the ability to zap its prey. It can fall from any height onto the ground and then reform itself at the bottom. End quote. Jack Harris, who had begun his career in vaudeville before becoming a film exhibitor and distributor, was keen to move into movie production and was intrigued by the idea, thinking that this story could mark his debut as a film producer. Discussions continued for several days after, including whether the monster should increase in size as it absorbed its victims, how it would move, whether it could be killed, and if not, how it could be immobilized. Just as importantly, they needed to come up with a name for the project, and they settled on a working title of The Molten Meteor, even though, as Harris explained, this had no chance of being applied to the final movie. But although they had a basic idea and a working title, as Harris explained in his autobiography, Father of the Blob, they didn't have a storyline. Quote, all we could put together was a series of horrifying incidents, showing how voracious and terrifying the molten meteor could be, and this wouldn't even make a good short subject. End quote. Without a storyline, there was no hope of getting the film financed, but this didn't stop Harris from trying. His first port of call was with two friends who had connections at a low-budget film studio which made Christian movies dedicated to spreading the good word of the Bible. The studio's main director, Irvin S. Yeaworth, who was nicknamed Shorty, was oddly enough very enthusiastic about the idea. But although he could provide the crew and the equipment, Harris was uncertain about whether he was the right man to direct a monster picture, saying, quote, since I had little to no idea how to budget a movie, I needed the crew and equipment that Shorty had assembled and his obvious enthusiasm to help get the movie made. Shorty had made no secret of his exclusive dedication to the creation of religious films, and when I challenged his ability to devote himself to my monster movie, he told me of a meeting with his top staff discussing the project. He was able to tell them the monster represents God's wrath at the failings of humanity. End quote. And interestingly enough, this idea would find its way into the remake more than 30 years later. Shorty also introduced Harris to his head writer, Ted Simonson, who came up with the basic storyline about a group of teenagers who encounter the molten meteor and through a series of misadventures are able to overcome the monster. By 1953, they finally had the basic shooting script together, and so then began a rather lengthy process of trying to find a financing partner. Scripts were sent to Disney, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, Warner Brothers and Universal Pictures, all of whom politely but firmly rejected it. In the end, Harris set about financing the film independently, taking out a second mortgage on his home. He also convinced friends and business contacts to come up with the missing funds or donate expensive lab work for free in return for remuneration if and when the film was eventually sold. And so, with a story, a director, and a budget, the casting process began. And this was something that was particularly challenging because, as Harris put it, quote, we realized early on that the teenage protagonist would have the major burden of making this monster come to life. We lined up all the special effects, both animation and miniatures, but we had to find our male lead. End quote. One night, watching a TV show called Playhouse 90, Harris noticed an actor whose performance, albeit in a supporting role, affected him greatly. Finding out that his name was Steve McQueen, he contacted Shorty, who not only knew him, but also didn't particularly like him, saying, quote, "He's a dirty guy, a troublemaker and a nuisance," end quote. Nevertheless, Harris got his way, using Shorty's existing relationship with McQueen as leverage. McQueen, who would receive top billing in the movie as Stephen McQueen, was rather desperate for money and, when agreeing to the contract, took a flat fee of $3,000 instead of a lower upfront fee and a percentage of the profits. And this was a very short-term win that he would come to regret, given that, on its eventual release, the Blob grossed over $4 million at the US box office. But even as the film went into production, there was still no title for the movie, nor indeed a name for the monster. As filming continued, everyone in the production team was invited to put their ideas for a title on a large blackboard, and one of these suggestions, no doubt a joke, was the glob that girdles the globe. Even by the time they came to shoot the main titles, they still hadn't decided on the name of the movie, and so they put it to the vote. As a result, it was decided to call the film The Glob, but, as it turned out, this name had already been copyrighted by a syndicated newspaper comic book strip. In desperation, Harris realized that by changing just one letter, both the film and the monster would eventually have their names. And this is how the movie came to be called The Blob. This entire story, incidentally, is drawn from Harris's autobiography, but Wikipedia entries and several websites tell a different story. In these versions, the script and the title are credited to a writer called Kate Phillips, also known as Kate Linkletter. But according to Harris, these accounts are not true. He alleges that while Phillips was hired to work as a script editor, the first thing that she did when arriving to work was to insult Shorty's wife. He went on to say, quote, "After 2 days, in exchange for $125 and a writing credit, her services were terminated. She had nothing to do with the final film. The fact that she has taken credit for the film that she didn't deserve and is erroneously credited in various places on the internet and elsewhere as having named the film is a very small, yet very wet towel on the film and its legacy." End quote. In total, The Blob cost $130,000 to make, which is the equivalent of about $1.5 million today. Once completed, it was purchased for twice that amount by Paramount Pictures, who initially planned to screen it as the support movie in a double bill with their science fiction thriller, I Married a Monster from Outer Space. But despite receiving very bad reviews from the press, The Blob turned out to be the far more popular of the two movies, and eventually began to be screened as the main feature. It became a huge success, partly because it catered to the emerging youth phenomena of the teenager, and also because it was an ideal vehicle for the emerging drive-in market. In fact, you can see The Blob being screened during the drive-in sequence of the 1950s set cult movie musical Grease. It also became something of a cultural phenomena, with comedians like Steve Allen, Bob Hope and Jack Benny name-checking the film whenever they needed to get a cheap breakout laugh from their audiences. As I mentioned, in the US alone, it grossed over $4 million, which is the equivalent of just under $46 million today. And that's not bad at all for a next-to-no-budget movie from a first-time producer, directed by a filmmaker who largely made Christian faith movies, and who had framed the titular monster to his crew as the personification of the wrath of God. But if we're being completely honest, for all its success and cultural impact at the time, the original The Blob is not a great movie. Its pacing is slow, the acting, even from McQueen, is pretty wooden, and while I wouldn't agree with Joe Dante, who called it one of the worst horror films ever made, it's not exactly a classic of either the science fiction or the horror genres. And despite its success, the belated sequel, Beware the Blob, wouldn't emerge until over 14 years later, in 1972. Directed by Larry Hagman, also known as J.R. Ewing from the TV series Dallas, it has even less to recommend it than its predecessor, and to be honest, it's probably one best forgotten. Meanwhile, in 1959, another amorphous monster emerged from both beneath the Earth and also potentially from outer space, suggesting a hybrid of both the Blob and X the Unknown. This was Kaltiki, the Immortal Monster, directed by Ricardo Freda and an uncredited Mario Bava, and it's a film that we spoke of briefly back in episode 38. But this film seems to be in something of a minority, because despite their relative successes, these slimy monstrosities of X the Unknown and the Blob didn't really cause too much in the way of imitations. The H-Man, released in 1958, also featured blob-like monsters, but given the date of its production can hardly be said to have been influenced by either. In fact, it wouldn't be until 1985 that we would really see another film that was working along the same lines. This was The Stuff, an independent film directed by Larry Cohen, which was both a monster movie and a satire on consumerism and the US food industry. In this, a mysterious, sweet and highly addictive substance is found bubbling up from the ground, and so quite naturally, it ends up being marketed to the general public as a delicious yogurt-like snack. Creating an army of zombie-like stuff addicts, it eventually turns out that the goo is in fact alive, and while it seems to temporarily be destroyed, the nefarious businessmen behind the Stuff Company have other ideas. It's a goofy, stupid, and genuinely enjoyable film, though it suffered extensive cuts at the hands of its distributors on its original release. It's since gone on to be restored and has become something of a cult classic, and while I wouldn't necessarily go out of your way to hunt it down, it is a diverting entertainment should you happen to stumble across it. But at around the same time, a deal was beginning to take shape in the background, as an up-and-coming screenwriter with ambitions to direct began reaching out to Jack Harris about acquiring the rights to mount a remake of The Blob as his own debut feature, and his name was Chuck Russell. Chuck Russell was born in Illinois in 1958 and says that his love for theatre and performance dates all the way back to grade school, when he wrote his very first play, a version of the story of Pandora's Box. In an interview for the Scream Factory Blu-ray release of The Blob, he says that another kid in his class was desperate to be in the play, but only as the character of Hercules. Now, Hercules, as you probably know, doesn't actually appear in the story of Pandora's Box in any way, shape or form, but Chuck's teacher insisted that the part be written in, and this was something that he has joked was his first experience of artistic collaboration and compromise. Despite this very early beginning, his true love of theatre fully emerged at the University of Illinois. It was here that he learned to write dialogue as well as experiment with improvisation, and he became heavily involved with the Chicago theatre scene. It was also here that he truly became fascinated with what he calls the illusion of cinema, particularly the stunt work and visual effects of the silent film era, and the physical performances of Charlie Chaplin, Buster Keaton, and Harold Lloyd. On graduating, he decided to move to LA to pursue his ambitions, though he's admitted that at the time it felt akin to trying to become an astronaut, a nice idea, but seemingly unobtainable. Giving himself 2 years to make it, he moved to Hollywood and began to work in any role that would give him experience and exposure. Here he began working as a production assistant on a 1976 movie called Carquake, an action comedy film directed by Paul Bartel and starring David Carradine. From here, he worked his way up through the industry, sometimes as a second assistant director and sometimes as a producer on low-budget crime dramas and comedies, including Bobby Joe and the Outlaw in 1976 and Chatterbox in 1977. The first horror film on which he worked came in 1980, when he was employed as a line producer on a supernatural thriller called The Hearse, which starred Trish Van Devere and Joseph Cotton. This film follows a school teacher who, after recovering from a nervous breakdown, spends the summer in a small rural town in a house left to her by her late aunt. Once there, she is haunted by ghostly visions, including a menacing black hearse and its equally menacing driver. It's not a great film, in my opinion, with its black hearse being somewhat overshadowed by the far more terrifying car and driver of Burnt Offerings, released 4 years earlier in 1976. In 1981, he worked as an executive producer on the teen slasher Hell Night, which featured a post-exorcist Linda Blair undergoing a particularly unpleasant sorority initiation in a Gothic manor house. Although it was not reviewed favourably by the critics, who by this time were getting a little tired of the slasher movie, the film did reasonably well at the box office and has since gone on to gain a cult following. Rather unfairly, lead actress Linda Blair was nominated for Worst Actress at that year's Razzies, losing out, if that's the right word, to Faye Dunaway and Bo Derek for respectively Mummy Dearest and Tarzan the Ape Man. Perhaps more importantly, it was on this film that Russell first met Frank Darabont, who would, of course, go on to become a multi-Oscar-nominated director and writer, and with whom he would develop a very successful creative partnership. Russell's real big break came with the movie Dreamscape, released in 1984, which he co-wrote with director Joseph Ruben and David Lowery. This is a fantasy, horror, political thriller hybrid, starring Dennis Quaid as a psychic with the ability to enter other people's dreams. Also starring Max von Sydow, Kate Capshaw and Christopher Plummer, it was a box office success, grossing $12.1 million on a $6 million budget, the equivalent of $38 million against a budget of $19 million today. Mixing multiple genres, Dreamscape set the tone for Russell's hybrid approach to filmmaking that we see in The Blob, and it also showed he had a considerable talent for writing dream sequences, something that would become incredibly important for his first feature as director. Although by this stage he had begun to experience success behind the camera, he also started to worry that he might be stuck in production forever, something that he had no real desire to do. And so he began to look for a vehicle that he could make his own, a property that would enable him to finally break through as a director. At this time in Hollywood, remakes of 1950s B-movies had become rather a trend, a movement supported by the development in special makeup effects that we discussed back in episode 13. Carpenter's reboot of The Thing had crash-landed, sadly literally, in 1982, and had been joined in the same year by Paul Schrader's remake of the classic Cat People. David Cronenberg had begun pre-production on his updating of the 1958 B-movie The Fly, and Tobe Hooper, director of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, had also started pre-production on his remake of Invaders from Mars, which had originally been released in 1953. At this point, Russell began to think about The Blob, a film that he had seen on TV as a kid and which he says made quite an impression. He was particularly fascinated by the titular monster, something that he describes as both surreal and minimalist, a creature without shape, without reason, which is ultimately the essence of evil. With this in mind, he approached original producer Jack H. Harris about optioning the film rights. Harris, as Russell would later recall, quote, was nice enough to give me the opportunity to put it together, end quote. With the deal agreed between them, Russell then began working with Frank Darabont on the screenplay and then set about looking for a studio to assist with financing. They initially approached New World Pictures, who were not particularly convinced either by the idea of a remake or entrusting it to a first-time director. But they were impressed enough by the screenplay and by Russell's previous work on Dreamscape to offer a very different and somewhat surprising proposition. In 1984, New Line had released Wes Craven's A Nightmare on Elm Street, a low-budget supernatural slasher made for just over $1 million, and which had grossed nearly 60 times that amount. One of the first films that New Line had produced, as opposed to just distributing, it had paved the way for them to become a successful studio, and had also earned them the nickname The House That Freddy Built. Naturally, this success spawned a sequel, which sadly failed to live up to the first picture, critically or financially, grossing $30 million against a budget of $3 million. Still, a very impressive return, but nowhere near what New Line had been hoping for, and as a result, they were uncertain whether to continue with the franchise or whether they should just end it there and then. But the scriptwriting team of Russell and Darabont showed promise, and Russell had already proven his ability to handle dream sequences with Dreamscape just a few years earlier. So, instead of offering him the Blob, they offered him the third in the Elm Street franchise, which he would co-write with Darabont from a screenplay by original Elm Street creator Wes Craven. A Nightmare on Elm Street 3 Dream Warriors is now seen as the best of the Elm Street sequels, though I have to say, in my opinion, the bar is set fairly low. Nevertheless, it did respectably enough at the box office to resurrect the franchise, something that was in no small part down to the reappearance of Heather Langenkamp as original Final Girl Nancy and John Saxon repeating his role as her father. What Russell brought to the franchise, and this is either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on how you look at it, was a far more darkly comedic tone, particularly in how he decided to adapt Craven's original screenplay. Quote, "I looked at what Wes Craven had done and said, this is absolutely great and terrifying. But I felt that by the time I came along on 3, the way to go was to make the whole idea of dreams and nightmares into a carnival and go further into the dreams and make Freddy Krueger more outrageous and add more of an element of dark humour. That worked, and the series went in that direction from then on." End quote. Like I say, either a good thing or a bad thing, depending on your point of view. But what the success of this film did do is pave the way for the Blob remake, something of which Russell would later say, quote, "In trying to direct the Blob, I got Elm Street, and in directing Elm Street, I got to direct the Blob." End quote. And now we are getting into the spoilers, so as always, if you have yet to see the movie, please do approach with caution. Eventually released, not by New World, but by TriStar Pictures, the story is very close to the original in its simplicity. A blob-like creature lands on Earth and devours everything in its path, growing to an enormous size and seemingly unstoppable as it oozes and eats its way through small-town America. Much like its titular monster, the story is minimal, surreal, and relentless. A riot of over-the-top practical effects and dark humour that plays with audience expectations as to which characters will live, which characters will die, and which ones will turn out to be the heroes. It also takes the origins of the creature in a very different direction. In the first film, the Blob is very much alien, but in this version, it turns out to be a man-made biological weapon. In this, the film reaches back to the military conspiracy horrors of George A. Romero's movie The Crazies from 1973, while also anticipating the later and more politically themed works of co-writer Frank Darabont, particularly his 2007 adaptation of Stephen King's The Mist. Filmed on location in Abbeville, Louisiana, which was chosen for its small-town classic Americana feel, the movie opens in what initially appears to be a ghost town. The streets are strangely deserted, except for a black cat crossing our path and the autumn leaves blowing in the wind. It is hard to tell whether this is post or pre-apocalypse, although this uncertainty is soon removed by the cheers from the crowd at the school football game, providing both the reason for the town's seeming desertion and also acting as an introduction to the key characters. Here we first meet cheerleader Meg, played by Shawnee Smith, and footballer Paul, played by Donovan Leitch, the very personification of hero and heroine, and we fully expect to follow them for the duration of the film. We are also introduced to comic sidekick Scott, and catch a brief glimpse of Reverend Mika, who will become an important figure later on. He is played by actor and writer Del Close, who Russell first met in his college days on the Chicago improv circuit, and who had, interestingly enough, also appeared in the movie Beware the Blob in 1972. So far, so normal. In fact, it all seems rather cliché, giving a sense that this remake is not so much subverting its original inspirations as it is replicating them. This is reinforced by the introduction of Kevin Dillon as troubled teen Brian Flagg, who is so much a hybrid of James Dean and Marlon Brando that it feels as if he's just wandered in from the 1950s. In fact, it's only his incredibly dodgy mullet haircut that dates the movie in the then present day of 1988, making him not so much a rebel without a cause as a rebel without a hairbrush, or indeed a mirror. After some nice intercutting between Brian's attempt to jump the ruined bridge and the cheers from the football field, we then meet waitress Fran, played by Candy Clark, and Sheriff Herb, played by Jeffrey DeMunn. These fulfill two further stereotypes of the horror sci-fi movie, the motherly and caring diner waitress and the noble sheriff, harbouring an unrequited love that we hope will blossom by the end of the film. But what Russell and Darabont are doing here is setting up audience expectations only to knock them all down rather brutally as the narrative progresses. In much the same way that nominal heroine Marion Crane gets slaughtered in the first 40 minutes of Psycho, here football hero Paul will become a very early victim of the Blob, killed quite spectacularly in what is possibly the most brutal death of the movie. Our middle-aged lovebirds will also be killed before they manage their first kiss, bad boy Brian will become a hero instead of a rebel, and cheerleader Meg will become a gun-toting figure of female empowerment who, quite honestly, puts the Terminator's Sarah Connor to shame. And it's not just in the characters that the two writers seek to subvert the original movie. There is also, much as in Dream Warriors, a healthy amount of comedy, as evidenced by the scene where Paul and Scott attempt to buy condoms and are interrupted in their task by the Reverend. But this comedic approach did not sit at all well with original producer Harris. He would later say that this version did not hold up to the premise of his original film, though I would politely suggest that he may have been somewhat biased and rather blinkered in his analysis of the strengths of his 1958 movie. Russell, on the other hand, seems to have been far more realistic, if more irreverent, in his views about the original source material, saying, quote, "I've never believed that The Blob was a full-blown classic. I love the film, but the truth was that the original was a low-budget throwaway cheapie. I've always wanted to make a big monster movie with a capital M, and I felt The Blob was a great archetype for that kind of terror. The Blob is an organic disease writ in the form of a creature that made a lot of sense as a vehicle to scare people. What I proposed to do was elaborate on that fear and bring it up to 80s standards." End quote. The main update, of course, is in the depiction of the Blob itself, which soon makes its entrance in much the same way as the original, hiding within a crashed meteorite until it cracks its way free. But unlike the first Blob, which was made from large weather balloons and silicone gel, in this version they opted for something a little more sophisticated, though, much like the first, this was all done through practical effects. The Blob was created by designer Tony Gardner, who began his effects career working on the video for Michael Jackson's Thriller before graduating to The Return of the Living Dead in 1985. For The Blob, he was hired, as Russell would put it, to bring weirdness to life, heading up a team of 30 in what he described as his Blob Shop. Russell's direction for Gardner and the Blob Shop was to make the monster look as real and as threatening as possible, something that had never really been achieved in the original, as the director would later explain. Quote, "In the original, any healthy person could run away from the Blob. The only time anybody got blobbed was when they tripped or broke a heel. Before I wrote the script, I looked at a lot of National Geographic footage of amoeba and jellyfish, and immediately came up with a blob that was fast-moving, predatorial, and very nasty." End quote. But although the monster was fully visualized on paper, even Russell admitted that he had no idea how challenging working with the Blob would be, eventually describing it as the most temperamental actor on set. Part of the challenge was that it behaved differently in testing than it did in rehearsal, and then differently again when it came to the actual filming itself, which is perhaps no wonder considering its construction. As designer Gardner explained at the time of the film's release, quote, "It's basically silk bags injected with gravy thickener. Silk bags of various sizes were sewn together, and the food additive methyl cellulose was put in them. By manipulating those sacks, you were able to get a distinct but limited movement, and a blob that could roll rather freely and still keep its shape." And of course it is with the Blob itself that the film either succeeds or fails. And after a slow intro that takes us 30 minutes into the film, Russell and Darabont wisely decide to reveal their monster by killing off a main character in the most horrifying way possible. After a visit to the hospital and a brilliant cameo from Jack Nance of Eraserhead and Twin Peaks, football hero Paul is enveloped by the Blob as Meg watches on in horror, her attempts to pull him free resulting in his arm being pulled loose from its socket as his face melts beneath the purple and translucent ooze. This too was achieved through practical effects, with actor Donovan Leitch held beneath incredibly heavy parachute silk bags filled with methyl, which to the actor felt as though he were literally being buried alive. And on top of the indignity and discomfort of being blobbed, Leitch was initially not that happy with his character being killed off so early in the movie, and had to be sold the idea by the director, saying, quote, "I remember when they offered me the role, Chuck Russell said to me, 'Look, this is how we are going to set the story up. We are going to set you up like you are the lead, and when you die, it's going to be a shock to the audience. So even though you're only in the first 15 to 20 minutes of the movie, it's a really important part.' And I thought, you're right, that's pretty cool, as you don't normally see the hero dying off at the beginning of the action." End quote. It's a fantastically gross-out moment that instinctively raises a laugh of shock as much as it does a scream. From this point on, we know that the film can and probably will take us anywhere, and that the conventions of the classic monster movie are no longer going to apply. But unlike X the Unknown, which takes its horrors very seriously, the Blob plays with the kitsch possibilities of its source material and becomes a hugely entertaining romp. One of the reasons that it's so successful is the way in which it strings its audience along by their expectations, before revealing some quite epically gooey and consequentially hilarious moments of body horror. We have the lecherous womanizer Scott, the trunk of whose car contains a cartoonish array of seduction materials, and who comes to a sticky end as his date is devoured from the inside out by the Blob. This is soon followed by the scene in the diner, where the dishwasher reaches into what he believes is a clogged sink, only to be pulled in head first down the plug hole. It is implausible, ridiculous, and also quite brilliant, and is a scene that Russell has described as speaking to a primal fear that lies within us all. I remember seeing this film at the cinema when it first opened in the UK with a group of university friends, many of whom I am still friends with to this day, and I'm sure that they will also recall that by this point, most of the patrons of the cinema had their feet lifted off the floor and were watching wide-eyed in a mixture of hilarity and absolute horror. By the time that motherly diner waitress Fran is trapped by the Blob in a phone booth, in a scene surely inspired by Hitchcock's The Birds, you have to decide whether to be swept along by the insanity or give up altogether and watch something more serious. Yes, it is stupid, and yes, it is kitsch and campy, but sometimes that really is all you want from a movie. To continue with a plot summary would be to catalogue a veritable cornucopia of amusingly grisly deaths, as well as some nice visual gags that spoof Friday the 13th. But while these are the main appeal of the movie, there is a little bit more to it than that. Or, at the very least, there is certainly more to it than there was in the original, which, despite people's claims, was not an allegory for communism. Harris in particular has claimed these political readings to be absolute hogwash, though he did later joke that maybe that was why the movie never really played in Russia. As he said in his autobiography, quote, "Through the years, viewers have interpreted hidden messages and symbolism in the Blob. Many saw it as the need to stop communism from overtaking the world, others as vile monopolies gobbling up independent enterprise, and still others saw the Blob as God's messenger sent to destroy the world's evildoers. In reality, the Blob was conceived only to do what good movies do best: entertain, stimulate good word of mouth, and maybe cause audiences to enjoy a scary moment or two. The Blob is about having a good time at the movies." End quote. As we heard earlier, the idea of religious symbolism was one by which director Shorty persuaded his team of religious filmmakers to get on board the original project in the 1950s. But it's also a theme that appears explicitly in the remake, spoken by the initially misguided and then dangerously insane Reverend Meeker, who comes to believe that the Blob is an agent of revelation. That these are the rantings of an apocalypse zealot is made pretty clear by the climax, a scene which suggests a potential sequel that sadly never emerged. But there have also been those, including critics of the time, who felt that in some way the Blob was a metaphor for the AIDS crisis, which, as we discussed in episode 43, was peaking at about this time. This is no doubt prompted by the discovery, late in the film, that the Blob is actually an experimental virus grown out of control. But I found no other evidence that this was either Russell or Darabont's intent, and even on multiple viewings, I have struggled to find an argument for this interpretation over and above the inclusion of the word virus. The only time that the Blob is shown in an even vaguely sexual situation is during the scene with Scott and his date, and then it's played more for laughs than it is a metaphorical message. So I have to say that personally, I think this interpretation is something of a stretch, even for the Blob. A more definite subtext, though, is provided by the revelation that the Blob is not extraterrestrial but man-made, a military weapon that speaks as much to 1980s conspiracy theory as X the Unknown spoke to 1950s atomic panic. Here, the US government is the bad guy, endangering the lives of its citizens as it attempts a seek and capture effort headed by Dr. Meadows and his government-sanctioned biological containment team. Despite his initially friendly demeanour, we soon discover that Dr. Meadows represents the flip side of Dr. Royston, declaring civilian life expendable if it means he can advance US military might against the Russians during the Cold War of the 1980s. This plot twist and the involvement of the military in the narrative did not sit at all well with original producer Jack H. Harris, who was highly critical of the remake in his autobiography. Quote, "One evening after the picture was completed, we had a very private screening at Columbia Studios. My worst fears were realized. When the lights went up, I looked around at the Columbia executives who were applauding what they had seen. The CEO stood up and said, 'I hope you guys have sequel rights. This is a winner.' It wasn't." End quote. And indeed, it most certainly was not. Opening in the US in August 1988, it competed for attention in a summer of blockbusters: Who Framed Roger Rabbit, Coming to America, Die Hard, Young Guns, and, rather ironically, A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. In addition to jostling for room, its combination of horror and humour also confused the marketplace, particularly coming hot on the heels of the far more serious and far more intellectual remake of that other 1950s B-movie, The Fly. Reflecting on this, Russell later said, quote, "Maybe it was a mistake to do a remake of The Blob with a sense of humour. I thought it would be an entertaining interpretation. Unfortunately, it was released late in a very hectic summer filled with big films, and it didn't have a particularly good ad campaign." End quote. Sadly, this perfect storm led to the film turning into a dismal failure, grossing only $8 million against its production budget of $10 million. Reviews were also less than favourable. The LA Times accused Russell of trying to have his cake and eat it, saying that the film, quote, "never balances its varying tones of horror and humour, sitcom realism and social criticism," end quote. Going on to say that the humour, quote, "tends to have a callous and queasy edge," end quote. They made that sound like a bad thing. The New York Times was not much better, saying that while it was certainly more violent, more spectacular, and more cynical than the original, it would not be earning a place in film history, as its predecessor had. This may possibly be true. Along with X the Unknown, the 1958 version was one of the first of its kind. But to paraphrase the great Herschel Gordon Lewis, just because a film is the first of its kind, it doesn't mean it's any good. And while the remake may not have a place in cinema history, it at least earned a place in the hearts of its fans, who have seen it quite rightly become something of a cult and campy classic. Admittedly, while some of its effects have stood up rather well, quite a few others have dated rather badly, But even then though, this does give the movie a certain goofiness and charm that for me makes that somewhat forgivable. As of the time of recording, there are stories of another reboot, allegedly to be helmed by director David Bruckner. His films The Ritual and The Night House were both rather impressive, but I have to say, personally, his Hellraiser reboot left me a little bit cold. Given his track record, I would imagine, if nothing else, he won't be including many comedic moments, and will doubtless present something far darker. Only time will tell. Following The Blob, Chuck Russell directed 1994's The Mask, which had originally been lined up as a horror movie, but which he turned into a Tex Avery cartoon-style comedy that would make full-blown stars out of Jim Carrey and Cameron Diaz. After this came the Schwarzenegger thriller Eraser in 1996, horror movie Bless the Child in 2000, and 2002's action-adventure movie The Scorpion King. He was originally attached to the 2004 Tom Cruise movie Collateral, which eventually went to Michael Mann, although Russell retained an executive producer credit. After a 14-year hiatus from directing, aside from an episode of cult sci-fi series Fringe, he returned with 2016's I Am Wrath, starring John Travolta, which probably tells you all you need to know about that one. More recently, he directed the remake of 1980's cult horror Witchboard, which sadly received mixed to average reviews. As of the time of recording, IMDb says he has 3 films in pre-production and 1 in post, so we won't have long to wait to see if any of these mark a return to form or not. Given that one of these is called The White House Demon, about a demon-possessed president of the United States, one can only hope. X the Unknown and The Blob are, of course, both films about amorphous beasties, and both gleefully throw any number of lovable and innocent victims in the path of their titular monsters. But while one is deadly serious and the other a broad comedy, both manage to explore, to some degree or another, the political anxieties of the time in which they were made, the threat of atomic warfare on one hand, and the threat of biological warfare on the other. In the first, science is our saviour, and in the second, our potential destroyer, 2 sides of an argument that has raged since the Age of Enlightenment and the scientific revolution of the 18th century. Given the precipice on which we stand today, it seems now more likely than ever that soon we will discover which side is ultimately going to win. It's rather unfortunate then that, looking at the men leading the charge, not a single one of them resembles Dr. Royston, or indeed Professor Quatermass, in the slightest. All of which brings me to the end of this week's episode, so thank you very much for listening. If you've enjoyed the show, please remember to rate, review and subscribe wherever you listen to podcasts, and please also consider sharing this episode with any horror-loving friends. You can also contact the show via email at thehorrordouble@gmail.com or follow our Instagram, thehorrordouble. Next week, we are off to New York in search of missing siblings and finding instead something far darker. First up, we have horror noir The Seventh Victim from producer Val Lewton and director Mark Robson, a choice which sadly brings us ever closer to the end of the Val Lewton horror series. Released in 1943, this stars Jean Brooks, Tom Conway, Kim Hunter, and Isabel Jewell. Then we follow this with Inferno from 1980 and director Dario Argento. This was his follow-up to Suspiria and stars Lee McCloskey, Daria Nicolodi, Irene Miracle, and Eleonora Giorgi. If you'd like to watch along, you can find out where these films are streaming in your area by visiting justwatch.com. And if they're not available in your country and you have a VPN, you can also see where they might be playing in other regions. So I'll be back next Sunday for the discussion, and until then, thank you very much for listening and have a really great week. Goodbye.